It was a quiet evening in the city, the kind where the streets buzzed with the hum of daily life winding down. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across sidewalks and storefronts. A man walked briskly down one of these streets, his steps steady and purposeful. He wasn't just any man. He was an undercover agent working for a federal agency. His job was to gather information on criminal activities happening in the area. For weeks he had blended into the neighborhood, wearing clothes that matched the locals, keeping his head down and doing everything he could to stay unnoticed. This particular evening marked the end of a long day of work. He had spent hours inside an apartment building, collecting evidence against a dangerous group involved in illegal activities. It was risky work, but it was also part of his mission to help keep communities safe. As he stepped out onto the street heading toward his car parked a block away, he felt a sense of relief. The hard part was over. Now all he had to do was get back to headquarters and hand over the evidence he'd gathered. But fate had other plans. As he turned a corner, he noticed a police car pulling up beside him. Two officers got out quickly, their faces stern and focused. One of them called out, "Hey, stop right there." The man froze, confused. What did they want? Had someone reported something suspicious? That wouldn't be unusual in this neighborhood, where tensions between residents and law enforcement often ran high. Still, he didn't think twice about complying. After all, he was used to dealing with authority figures as part of his job. He raised his hand slightly, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said calmly, trying to explain himself. "I'm just walking to my car." The officers weren't satisfied. They demanded he put his hands higher, shouting commands that came fast and sharp. The man followed their instructions, hoping to defuse the situation. But before he could say another word, things took a turn for the worse. One of the officers grabbed him roughly by the arm, twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through his body as he stumbled forward, caught off guard by the sudden aggression. "Wait," he tried to shout, his voice strained. "You don't understand, I'm—" His words were cut short as the second officer swung a baton at him, striking him hard across the legs. The blow knocked him off balance, and he fell to the ground. Panic surged through him as he realized what was happening. These officers had no idea who he really was. To them, he was just another face in the crowd, someone who fit a vague description of suspicious behavior. But to him, this was more than just a misunderstanding. It was a nightmare unfolding in real time. The beating continued, each strike landing with brutal force. He tried to shield himself, curling into a protective ball on the cold pavement. His mind raced. Should he reveal his true identity? Would they even believe him if he told them he worked for the FBI? In that moment, fear clouded his judgment. All he could do was endure the pain, praying that it would stop soon. When it finally did, he lay there dazed and bleeding. His vision blurred as he watched the officers handcuff him and drag him to their patrol car. The irony of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. Here he was, someone whose entire career revolved around justice and safety, now treated like a criminal by the very people sworn to uphold the law. And the worst part? His badge, tucked safely in his jacket pocket, remained undiscovered, a small piece of metal that could have changed everything. Witnesses gathered around, some recording the scene on their phones, others shouting angrily at the officers. The video footage spread online within minutes, sparking outrage across social media platforms. People saw yet another example of excessive force, another black man beaten without cause. Little did they know, this wasn't just any man. It was someone who dedicated his life to protecting others. For now, though, he was just another victim of a broken system, left battered and bruised on the side of the road. The video of the brutal beating spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere. Social media feeds, news channels, and even late-night talk shows. People couldn't stop talking about it. The footage showed a man being attacked by two police officers for no apparent reason. To the public, it looked like another case of excessive force against a black individual. Outrage poured in from all corners of the country. Protesters took to the streets holding signs that read, Justice for him and no more police brutality. The city buzzed with tension as people demanded answers and accountability. For the officers involved, things moved quickly. They claimed they were responding to reports of suspicious activity in the area, a claim that many found hard to swallow after watching the video. Their superiors initially backed them up, saying the officers had followed proper protocol. But behind closed doors, cracks began to form within the police department. Higher-ups scrambled to contain the growing scandal, knowing full well that this incident could tarnish the reputation of the entire force. Meanwhile, the man who had been beaten lay unconscious in a hospital bed, his body battered and broken. His injuries were severe, but doctors assured everyone he would survive. It wasn't until later that his colleagues from the federal agency he worked for finally pieced together what had happened. When he failed to check in after completing his assignment, alarm bells rang. Agents traced his last known location and discovered he had been arrested and beaten by local police. At first, the agency kept quiet. Revealing his identity too soon might make an already volatile situation worse. But as protests grew louder and the story dominated headlines, they realized they had no choice. The truth needed to come out. If people knew who this man really was, it would change everything. A few days passed before he regained consciousness. Lying in the sterile hospital room, hooked up to machines, he slowly opened his eyes. His body ached with every movement, and memories of the attack flooded back, in bits and pieces. He remembered the shouting, the baton strikes, the feeling of helplessness as he hit the ground. What he didn't remember was how he ended up in the hospital, or why his colleagues were standing around his bed looking grim. One of them stepped forward, pulling up a chair. "We need to talk," the colleague said gently. "Do you remember what happened?" He nodded weakly, wincing at the pain shooting through his ribs. "They thought I was someone else," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. They didn't listen. His colleagues exchanged worried glances. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a professional nightmare. Someone working undercover for the federal government had been assaulted by their own side. The irony was staggering. After hearing his account, the team decided it was time to act. They contacted the top brass in Washington, D.C., briefing them on the situation. Together, they agreed. The truth had to be revealed. The next morning, cameras lined up outside the hospital as reporters jockeyed for position. Word had leaked that something big was about to happen. Finally, a group of officials emerged, led by a high-ranking representative from the federal agency. Microphones thrust forward as journalists shouted questions. "We are here today to set the record straight," the official began, his tone calm but firm. "The individual involved in this incident is not just any citizen. He is one of ours, an agent working tirelessly to protect our nation's security." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks while camera operators zoomed in for close-ups. The official continued, explaining that the agent had been conducting critical operations when he was wrongfully detained and assaulted. "This is unacceptable," he declared. "Our agents risk their lives daily to serve this country. They deserve better than this." The announcement sent shockwaves across the nation. Social media lit up again, this time with a mix of disbelief and fury. How could this happen? How could trained officers fail to recognize one of their own? For the public, the revelation added a new layer of complexity to the story. Now, it wasn't just about race or policing. It was about systemic failures that allowed such a grave mistake to occur. Back at the police department, panic set in. The officers involved in the beating faced immediate suspension pending further investigation. Internal Affairs launched a deep dive into their records, uncovering troubling patterns. Both men had histories of complaints filed against them for using excessive force. Yet somehow, they had always managed to avoid serious consequences. This time, however, the stakes were higher. The spotlight was on them, and the pressure mounted with each passing day. As the story unfolded, the man at the center of it all remained hospitalized, recovering physically, but struggling emotionally. Visitors came and went. Family members, co-workers, even strangers who wanted to offer support. Each conversation weighed heavily on him. He hadn't asked for any of this attention. All he wanted was to heal and move on. But he knew that wasn't possible. His experience had become a symbol of something much larger, a rallying cry for change. Protests intensified in the days following the revelation. Crowds swelled as activists seized the moment to push for reforms. Signs now read, "Protect our protectors," alongside calls to end police brutality. Speeches echoed through city squares demanding justice not only for him, but for countless others who had suffered similar fates. For the officers involved, life became unbearable. Death threats poured in, forcing them into hiding. Their families faced backlash too, with neighbors shunning them and businesses refusing service. Meanwhile, legal teams prepared for what promised to be a long and grueling battle. Would the court see this as a tragic misunderstanding, or as yet another example of unchecked power gone horribly wrong? In the midst of it all, the man tried to focus on healing. Physical therapy sessions helped him regain strength, though scars, both visible and invisible, remained. Friends urged him to take time off work, but he refused. "I can't let them win," he told them. "If I stop fighting, then what was all this for?" His determination inspired those around him. Slowly but surely, the narrative shifted. This wasn't just a story of victimization, it was a story of resilience. And as the nation watched, waiting to see what would happen next, one thing was clear. This moment would leave a lasting mark on the fight for justice. The days following the revelation of the man's true identity were a whirlwind of emotions, investigations, and public outcry. The nation was gripped by the story, unable to look away as new details emerged. For the man at the center of it all, life became a strange mix of pain, frustration, and determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something bigger. Every decision he made, every word he spoke, carried weight far beyond his personal experience. As his condition improved, he began receiving visitors from all walks of life. Some were colleagues from the federal agency, offering support and updates on the internal investigation. Others were activists, lawyers, and community leaders who saw an opportunity to push for meaningful change. They sat by his bedside, sharing stories of others who had faced similar injustices but never received justice. These conversations left him with a heavy heart, but they also fueled his resolve. "I can't stay silent," he told one visitor, his voice firm despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "If this happened to me, a person whose job is to protect people, then what hope do regular folks have? I've got to speak up." With that mindset, he agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. He recounted every detail of the attack, describing how the officers ignored his attempts to explain himself and escalated the situation unnecessarily. His testimony painted a vivid picture of fear, confusion, and helplessness. He didn't hold back when talking about the physical pain or the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, but more than anything, he emphasized the broader implications of what had happened. "This isn't just about me," he said during one interview with investigators. "It's about trust, or the lack of it. When someone sees a badge, they should feel safe, not scared. What happened to me shows how broken that trust has become." His words resonated deeply, especially within the federal agency he worked for. Top officials were furious, not just because one of their own had been attacked, but because the incident exposed glaring flaws in the system. How could trained professionals fail to recognize an undercover agent? Why did they resort to violence so quickly? These questions haunted everyone involved, prompting soul-searching discussions about accountability and reform. Meanwhile, the two officers at the center of the controversy found themselves under intense scrutiny. Suspended without pay, they hired high-profile defense attorneys to represent them. Their legal team argued that the officers acted based on standard procedure and couldn't have known the man's true identity. They claimed the officers responded to a vague report of suspicious activity and followed protocol when they encountered resistance. But the public wasn't buying it. Videos of the beating showed otherwise. capturing moments where the man clearly tried to communicate before being struck. Social media exploded with screenshots and clips dissecting the officer's actions frame by frame. Commentators pointed out inconsistencies in their statements, while experts weighed in on whether their behavior aligned with proper police conduct. The pressure mounted, and soon, even some fellow officers began distancing themselves from the pair. Behind the scenes, internal affairs investigators dug deeper into the officers' backgrounds. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture. Both men had histories of complaints filed against them for excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional behavior. In most cases, these complaints had been dismissed or swept under the rug. Now those past incidents cast a long shadow over the present case, raising questions about why such patterns had gone unchecked for so long. For the man, learning about the officer's track records added another layer of anger to his already complicated emotions. "This didn't happen in a vacuum," he said during a private conversation with a close friend. "These guys weren't rogue cops. They were part of a system that let them get away with this stuff over and over again. If we don't fix that system, nothing will change." His perspective aligned closely with what activists across the country were saying. Protests continued to grow, drawing larger crowds and louder chants. Organizers used his story as a rallying point, highlighting how systemic issues within law enforcement disproportionately affected marginalized communities. Speeches echoed through city streets, calling for reforms like mandatory de-escalation training, independent oversight boards, and stricter consequences for misconduct. Amidst the chaos, the man decided to take a bold step. Still recovering from his injuries, he agreed to appear at a press conference organized by his agency. It was a risky move. His face was bruised, his body still weak, but he felt it was necessary. As he wheeled himself onto the stage in a wheelchair, the room fell, silent. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the stark contrast between his fragile state and the strength in his gaze. "I'm here today because I believe in justice," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "I wear this badge to serve and protect, but I am also a black man in America, and that alone made me a target. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much bigger problem." He went on to describe the attack in detail, holding nothing back. He talked about the fear he felt as the baton struck him, the frustration of knowing he couldn't defend himself, and the pain of realizing that even his badge couldn't shield him from prejudice. His words struck a chord with everyone listening, from reporters scribbling notes to viewers watching live streams at home. By the end of the press conference, tears filled his eyes, but his message was clear. Enough was enough. "We need real change," he concluded. "Not just empty promises or band-aid solutions. We need to rebuild trust between communities and law enforcement. And we need to start now." The impact of his speech rippled across the nation. News outlets replayed clips of his remarks, framing him as both a victim and a hero. Social media lit up with hashtags supporting his call for reform, while petitions demanding accountability gained thousands of signatures overnight. For many, his courage inspired a renewed sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, this moment could spark lasting transformation. As the days turned into weeks, preparations for the trial began. Lawyers on both sides gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and crafted arguments. The courtroom promised to be a battleground, with the nation watching closely to see how justice would be served. For the man, the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He wouldn't back down. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it head-on. Months passed before the trial finally began. By then, the nation had been on edge, waiting to see how justice would play out in a case that had become symbolic of so much more than one man's suffering. The courtroom was packed with people, reporters, scribbling notes, activists holding their breath, and ordinary citizens hoping for accountability. Every seat was taken, and even the hallways outside buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another court case. It was a moment that could shape the future of policing and community relations. The prosecution opened with a strong statement. They painted a picture of two officers who acted recklessly, ignoring basic principles of de-escalation and resorting to violence far too quickly. "This is not about a misunderstanding," the lead prosecutor said, his voice firm. "It's about choices. Choices made by individuals who swore an oath to protect and serve but instead chose to brutalize someone simply because they could. They called witnesses to testify, people who had seen the beating firsthand, internal affairs investigators who uncovered troubling patterns in the officers' past behavior, and even experts on police conduct. Each story added another layer to the narrative, reinforcing the idea that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger systemic issue. One witness, a neighbor who lived near where the attack took place, described hearing screams and seeing the man being struck repeatedly. "I'll never forget the sound," she said, her voice trembling. "It didn't sound like justice, it sounded like rage." For the defense, things were more complicated. Their strategy hinged on portraying the officers as professionals doing their job under difficult circumstances. They argued that vague reports of suspicious activity left the officers with limited information, forcing them to act cautiously. "They had no way of knowing who this person was," one attorney said. "In situations like this, split-second decisions are required. These officers followed protocol based on what they knew at the time." But the defense faced an uphill battle. Video footage of the beating contradicted their claims, showing moments where the man tried to communicate before being struck. The prosecution hammered this point home, playing the video multiple times during closing arguments. "If you follow protocol, you listen first," the prosecutor declared. "You don't swing a baton without understanding the situation. That's not policing, that's assault." As the trial progressed, the man at the center of the case took the stand. It was a pivotal moment, one that silenced the room. Dressed neatly, but still visibly scarred from the attack, he spoke with a mix of calmness and raw emotion. He recounted every detail, the initial stop, the escalation, the blows that left him broken on the ground. His words carried weight, not just because of what he endured, but because of who he was. Someone whose job was to uphold justice, now sitting in front of a jury asking for the same. "I didn't resist," he said, his voice steady despite the memories clearly haunting him. "I tried to explain myself. I told them there was a mistake, but they weren't listening. All they saw was my skin color, and that was enough for them to treat me like a threat." His testimony struck a chord with everyone in the room. Even some jurors exchanged glances, visibly moved by his account. When asked about the impact of the attack, he paused, collecting himself before speaking. "It's not just the physical pain," he said softly. "It's the loss of trust. How do you rebuild faith in a system that failed you? How do you walk down the street without wondering if it will happen again?" After weeks of testimonies, evidence presentations, and heated debates, the jury retired to deliberate. Tension hung thick in the air as people waited for the verdict. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans. Some prayed for justice, while others braced themselves for disappointment. Inside, the man sat quietly, with his legal team, trying to stay hopeful but steeling himself for any outcome. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom erupted. Guilty on multiple counts, including assault and abuse of power. Cheers broke out among supporters, while the officers sat stunned, their faces pale. The judge handed down sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years in prison, marking a rare instance of accountability in cases involving police misconduct. For many, it felt like a small victory, a crack in the wall of impunity, but it was a victory nonetheless. The fallout from the trial was immediate and intense. Supporters celebrated the verdict as a step toward justice, while critics argued that it barely scratched the surface of deeper issues within law enforcement. The officers appealed the decision, claiming they were unfairly targeted due to public pressure. Meanwhile, protests continued, with activists demanding broader reforms rather than focusing solely on individual cases. For the man, the verdict brought mixed emotions. Relief washed over him, knowing that those responsible would face consequences. But he also knew the fight wasn't over. "This isn't the end," he told reporters after the trial. "It's just the beginning. Real change doesn't come from locking up 2 officers. It comes from fixing the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. He threw himself into advocacy work, determined to turn his pain into purpose. He traveled across the Gee country, sharing his story at rallies, schools, and legislative hearings. Everywhere he went, he emphasized the need for accountability, transparency, and empathy in policing. "We can't keep treating parts of our population as enemies," he often said. "Law enforcement should be about protecting everyone, not punishing some." His efforts inspired others to join the movement. Community organizations partnered with local governments to implement new policies, such as mandatory body cameras, de-escalation training programs, and civilian oversight boards. While progress was slow and met with resistance, small victories began to add up. Cities started revising use of force guidelines, and departments introduced initiatives aimed at building trust with marginalized communities. Through it all, the man remained steadfast. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but he refused to give up. Every speech, every meeting, every conversation brought him closer to the change he envisioned. For him, this wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he went through. As months turned into years, his story became a cornerstone of the movement for reform. Documentaries, books, and even a feature film depicted his journey, highlighting both the tragedy and the triumph. Yet, despite the attention, he stayed humble, always reminding people that the real heroes were the ones still fighting on the front lines. For the man, the trial may have ended, but the mission continued. Justice, he believed, wasn't just a verdict. It was a process, and he was committed to seeing that process through, one step at a time. The months following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions for the man at the center of the story. On one hand, he felt a sense of relief. Justice had been served, at least in part. The officers who had brutalized him were now behind bars, and their conviction sent a clear message that accountability was possible, even in cases involving law enforcement. But on the other hand, the emotional scars ran deep. Nightmares haunted his sleep, replaying the attack over and over again. Trust, once shattered, is hard to rebuild, and every time he saw a police car or heard sirens, his heart raced. Despite the lingering trauma, he refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he channeled his pain into purpose. He became a voice, for those who couldn't speak for themselves, a symbol of resilience and hope. His advocacy work took him across the country, where he shared his story with anyone willing to listen. From packed auditoriums to intimate community meetings, he spoke passionately about the need for systemic change. "What happened to me wasn't just an accident," he often said. "It was a symptom of a much bigger problem. And if we don't address that problem, it will keep happening, to someone else, somewhere else." His speeches resonated deeply with audiences. People saw him not as a victim, but as a fighter. They admired his courage and determination, especially given everything he had endured. At rallies, people lined up to thank him, some breaking down in tears as they shared their own experiences of injustice. Activists embraced him as an ally, while lawmakers listened intently to his suggestions for reform. Slowly but surely, he became a bridge between communities and institutions, fostering dialogue where there had once been only division. One of the most impactful moments came when he addressed a group of young students at a high school in a predominantly black neighborhood. The room buzzed with energy as he walked in, leaning on a cane to support his still healing body. He began by talking about his childhood, how he grew up dreaming of making a difference, how he joined a federal agency because he believed in justice. Then, he opened up about the beating, describing the fear and anger he felt in those moments. "I'm standing here today not because I'm special," he told them, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm standing here because I refused to stay silent. You have power too, your voices matter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The students erupted in applause, many nodding in agreement. Afterward, several approached him, asking questions and sharing their dreams of becoming lawyers, activists, and even police officers who wanted to do things differently. Seeing their enthusiasm gave him hope. Change, he realized, didn't happen overnight. But it started with planting seeds. As his profile grew, so did opportunities to influence policy. He worked closely with civil rights organizations, helping draft legislation aimed at reducing police violence and increasing accountability. One of his key proposals focused on mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. Violence shouldn't be the first response, he argued during a legislative hearing. We need to teach officers how to handle situations without resorting to force. Another proposal called for independent oversight boards to review misconduct allegations. If we want trust, we need transparency, he explained. Communities deserve a say in how they're policed. Not everyone agreed with his ideas. Some lawmakers pushed back, claiming the reforms would make officers' jobs harder or put them at risk. Police unions criticized him, accusing him of vilifying an entire profession. Critics labeled him a radical, saying he was trying to dismantle law enforcement altogether. But he stood firm, countering their arguments with logic and empathy. This isn't about tearing anything down, he said during a televised debate. It's about building something better for everyone. Slowly, progress began to take shape. Several states adopted versions of the proposed reforms, passing laws that required stricter guidelines for use of force incidents and created civilian review boards. Cities implemented new programs, such as mental health responders accompanying officers on certain calls to reduce tensions. While these changes weren't perfect, and certainly didn't solve every issue, they represented steps in the right direction. For the man, each victory, no matter how small, reinforced his belief that persistence pays off. Behind the scenes, he faced challenges that few knew about. Advocacy work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. There were days when fatigue overwhelmed him, when the weight of everything he'd been through threatened to pull him under. Friends urged him to slow down, warning that he might burn out. But he shook his head, smiling faintly. I didn't choose this fight, he'd say. It chose me. And I can't stop until I see real change. He also dealt with backlash from unexpected places. Anonymous threats poured in, accusing him of stirring up trouble and dividing communities. Some former colleagues distanced themselves, fearing association with controversy. Yet he remained undeterred. If standing up for what's right makes me unpopular, so be it, he told a close friend late one night. I didn't survive that beating to stay quiet. Through it all, he found solace in connection. Conversations with survivors of police brutality reminded him why he kept going. Meetings with allies renewed his spirit. Even simple acts of kindness, from strangers thanking him to supporters sending letters of encouragement, lifted his mood on tough days. These interactions reminded him that he wasn't alone. Countless others shared his vision of a fairer, more just society. By the end of the year, his efforts had sparked tangible change, not just in policies, but in attitudes. Communities began organizing neighborhood watch programs in partnership with local police departments, fostering collaboration instead of conflict. Officers participated in workshops led by activists, learning how to approach situations with empathy rather than aggression. Media coverage shifted too, focusing less on sensationalism and more on solutions. For the man, these developments brought a sense of fulfillment. He hadn't set out to become a public figure, but he embraced the role because he saw its potential to drive meaningful impact. Still, he never lost sight of the bigger picture. This isn't about me, he often reminded himself. It's about creating a world where no one has to go through what I did. As the year drew to a close, he reflected on how far he'd come since that fateful evening on the street. The journey had been painful, messy, and unpredictable, but it had also been transformative. He emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to keep pushing for justice. Because for him, the fight wasn't just personal, it was universal. And as long as inequality persisted, he vowed to remain on the front lines, using his story to inspire others to join the cause. Years passed, but the memory of that night on the street never faded. For the man who had endured the beating, life moved forward in ways he could never have predicted. His story became a cornerstone of a movement, a spark that ignited conversations about justice, accountability, and reform across the nation. People didn't just remember him as someone who survived brutality. They remembered him as someone who turned pain into purpose. His journey wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it left an indelible mark on the fabric of society. The city where the attack happened transformed in subtle yet significant ways. Community policing initiatives flourished, bringing officers and residents together in spaces designed to foster trust. Neighborhood meetings replaced hostility with dialogue. Officers started attending block parties, school events, and local festivals, not as enforcers but as neighbors. These small steps may have seemed insignificant to outsiders, but for those living in the community, they represented hope. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight, but over time, relationships began to heal. Statues and memorials dedicated to victims of police brutality sprang up around the country, including one in the very neighborhood where the beating occurred. Etched into stone were the words, "In memory of those who suffered and inspired change." The monument served as both a tribute and a call to action, reminding everyone who walked by that progress comes from acknowledging the past while working toward a better future. For the man himself, life took on new meaning. Though his body still bore scars, both visible and invisible, he carried himself with quiet strength. He retired from active duty with the federal agency, choosing instead to focus on mentoring young agents and activists. In classrooms and community centers, he shared lessons learned not from textbooks but from lived experience. "You can't fix what you don't understand," he often told them. "Listen before you act. Empathy is your greatest tool." His advocacy work reached far beyond speeches and rallies. He co-authored a book detailing his journey, weaving personal anecdotes with insights about systemic issues within law enforcement. The book became a bestseller, sparking discussions in homes, schools, and even legislative chambers. Documentaries followed, capturing his story through interviews, archival footage, and commentary from experts. A feature film brought his experience to the big screen, introducing his fight for justice to audiences worldwide. Through all this attention, he remained grounded. Fame wasn't something he sought or enjoyed. It was simply a byproduct of standing up for what he believed in. What mattered most to him was the impact his story had on others. Every email from a stranger saying they felt inspired to join the fight against injustice fueled his determination. Every policy change credited to grassroots movements he supported reminded him why he kept going. But the road wasn't without its challenges. Pushback came in waves. Some critics accused him of overstating his role in driving reforms, dismissing his efforts as self-serving. Others argued that focusing too much on individual cases distracted from larger structural problems. While these comments stung, he chose not to engage. Instead, he doubled down on collaboration, partnering with organizations already doing the hard work of dismantling oppressive systems. One of the most rewarding aspects of his later years was seeing younger generations take up the mantle. Students he had spoken to years earlier now led protests, lobbied lawmakers, and organized voter registration drives. Activists he mentored founded nonprofits aimed at bridging gaps between communities and law enforcement. Even some police departments embraced his vision, implementing training programs focused on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Each success story gave him renewed energy, proving that change was possible if enough people worked toward it. As he grew older, he reflected on how far the world had come since that violent evening. Progress wasn't linear. It ebbed and flowed, faced setbacks, and required constant vigilance. But when he looked back, he saw undeniable growth. Conversations, once considered taboo, were now mainstream. Policies once deemed impossible were now law, and communities once divided were finding common ground. Still, he knew the fight wasn't over. Injustice persisted, wearing different masks but rooted in the same inequalities. On days when doubt crept in, he reminded himself of something he often told crowds during speeches. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step we take brings us closer to justice. Those words weren't just for others. They were for him too. When he finally stepped away from public life, handing the torch to the next generation of leaders, he did so with peace in his heart. He had done everything he could to leave the world better than he found it. His legacy wasn't written in monuments or headlines. It was etched in the lives he touched and the movements he helped shape. And so, as the sun set on his chapter of the story, he sat quietly on his porch, watching children play in the street below. Their laughter filled the air, a sound that once seemed distant but now felt within reach. For him, that was justice, not vengeance, not retribution, but the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Because in the end, his journey wasn't just about holding wrongdoers accountable. It was about building a world where everyone could walk freely, without fear of harm or prejudice. That dream, though unfinished, was worth every sacrifice.